In a previous video, we looked at balancing and truing the front and the back bodice, making sure that the side seams matched, that the shoulder seams matched, that the neckline and armholes made smooth transitions. We balanced out the back and front armholes to make sure that the back armhole was 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch longer than the front armhole. Now that we've drafted the skirt slopers, we can start balancing and truing all 4 of the slopers that we have so far. Remember that the skirt front on this side should match up to the skirt back. If you were sewing this together as a garment, point B to C to Q along the front side seam would match to point B to C to P on the back skirt. So ensure that lines B to C are the same on both the front and the back. They should be, it's sharing the same line. And then ensure that the curve C to Q matches the length of the curve C to P, either using a bendable ruler to measure that curve or a curve runner tool to ensure that these are the same length. So when you go to sew this together, you're not wondering why one side is longer than the other. The next thing to balance is going to be our front bodice to our front skirt. If I were to make these 4 slopers into a dress, I would be attaching them at the waistline. So I want to ensure that my front waistline on my skirt matches the front waistline on my bodice. Starting here, here's center front on my bodice and center front on my skirt. Point B to F along this trued waistline curve should be the same length as point H to point N. We use the same measurements to find these when drafting it, and when we're connecting these, omitting our dart intake, this segment would sew to meet this segment. And again, you can use a curving ruler to make sure that the lengths are the same. You can use a curve runner tool to ensure that the curve lengths are the same, or you can lay one piece on top of the other and ensure that you can walk these seams properly. So I'm going to place my bodice sloper on top of my skirt sloper, and you should barely see the skirt sloper draft underneath. And I can match up my center fronts, and at any point where these lines deviate, I can just curve my paper. This is looking pretty close. The first dart leg is matching up with the first dart leg on the bodice. It's a little bit off, but not too bad. It's close enough. I would say within 1/8 of an inch discrepancy is perfectly fine. It's about 1/16 of an inch off, not too bad. Now, if I were sewing this, my waistline dart on my bodice would close. This would be tucked inside of the garment. So I have to omit the space between F and R. Omit that dart space. And on my skirt, where my first dart leg begins, remember this dart is about 5/8 of an inch wide. Again, this dart intake would be omitted. So as I'm tracing segment B to F to match segment H to N, I'm now going to skip from this dart leg on my bodice all the way to this dart leg. I'm omitting that dart intake. So now I'm picking up over here at point R, and I'm going to omit this dart intake and pick it up on the other side of this dart leg on my front skirt. So matching up point R to this other dart leg. And again, walking along. Now, you might be able to see, as I walk along that waistline on the skirt, suddenly I meet the other dart in my skirt. Right here where this first dart leg is, I'm going to place a notch. so that when I go to sew, or if I go to sew my skirt to my bodice, I know where to position my second dart on my skirt. You can also, again, measure between the dart legs. There should be 1.25 inch spacing between these two darts. So there should be 1.25 inch spacing between your second dart leg on the bodice and this notch. So I've taken care of my B to F segment, matching my H to N segment. I've taken care of my R to my notch segment, matching the space between my two dart legs. And I'll take care of this last segment, the second dart leg over here, all the way across the waistline to where my side seam meets. Again, matching where my notch left off all the way to where my side seam meets on my bodice. So let me line up my notch with my second dart leg. And then as I see these lines start to divert, I'm gonna curve that around. And that's looking pretty close. Point P on my skirt is looking pretty close to point Q on my side seam on my bodice. A reminder, omit your dart intakes when you are walking seams and checking that things are properly balanced. So this segment would match to this segment. This segment between the second dart leg and the notch would match to this space between the two darts on the skirt. And from the notch to the side seam would match from the other side of your dart leg to the side seam on front skirt. Now, that worked out pretty well. Everything looks well balanced. I don't think I need to make any changes, but just to reiterate, in case you do find a major discrepancy, I want to explain what you can do. Let's, for the sake of example, pretend that we've got our notch laying here, even though I know it's not properly matching up with that second dart leg. Let's pretend that second dart leg is sitting here on our skirt. And we're walking along the waistline and we see that points P and Q are really far away from each other. This can happen on the waistline, it can happen on the side seam, on the shoulder seam. The same rules apply. If you're getting a discrepancy of 3/8 of an inch or more, something has gone wrong in the draft. Go back and recheck your measurements, recheck your draft. Ensure you're using the correct measurements and the correct calculations, because this big of a discrepancy means something has gone wrong in the drafting. If, however, you've got 1/4 inch discrepancy, let's say point P over here from my bodice and point Q over here from my skirt are about 1/4 inch off. This is something you're going to want to balance, and to do so, in an example like this, I would take point P from my bodice and push it in by 1/8 of an inch, or somewhere right in the middle between these 2 points. And I would go to my skirt and push point Q out by about 1/8 of an inch. Push this one out over here. I would then go back, maybe walk the waistline one more time, and then redraw my side seam from point O to the new P point, just tilting it in, and redraw my side hip arc curve from point C on my skirt out to my new point Q that's been pushed out. So 1/4 inch discrepancy, you're going to be balancing those points. It's not enough to need to go back into the draft and find out and redraft it or find out if something went awry. But if you're looking at 1/4 inch, you can just mark the line in between them and push each point to meet that median point. If when you're truing and balancing your drafts, you find that you have 1/8 of an inch discrepancy, leave it. I wouldn't worry about it. 1/8 of an inch is permissible. You can always stretch your fabric to make the points meet. I wouldn't worry about 1/8 of an inch, but if you're really concerned about it, you can do the same balancing that we did in the last example, where you can find the midpoint between the two discrepancies, pushing one point in to meet it and pushing the other point out to meet that median point. But 1/8 of an inch I usually don't worry about. I will leave it as is. Let's quickly look at the back. We now have our necessary notch there so that we know the position of our two darts on our skirt. And let's move over to the back skirt to match the back bodice. And just so you have some examples of what you can do, note that I've been walking one on top of the other like this. You can do that. You can also take one of your drafts, flip it over. That way you've got both of the curves from the bodice and the skirt going up in the same direction. Either technique will work. You can also, again, measure these curves with your curved ruler or a curve runner. So just a quick recap, I'm going to be measuring from point B to I on my bodice. That should be matching to point G to L on my back skirt. Omitting my dart intake, skipping the dart here, I'm going to go from point K to this second dart leg. And then I'll measure along the waistline, find where my second dart starts on the skirt and add a notch. And then skipping my skirt dart intake, I'll go to this other dart leg, matching it up with the notch, and measure the rest of this hip curve up to points P and M. So I'll do that really quickly. You can see. Okay, dart legs are matching up pretty well. That's looking good. Get to my second dart there. There's my notch. And then skipping from one dart leg to the other on the skirt. Yep, and point M and P are looking pretty good. Doesn't look like I have to do any balancing on that, but if I did, I would. When I draft my skirts, and when I transfer these onto oak tag or onto paper, I will sometimes put a notch on the back and the front at the hip level and mark that. Other than that, there aren't really any other notches, save for the dart legs and dart points as tailor's tacks in terms of notation on these skirt drafts. There is, however, one more thing we need to draft on our bodices. We've got the necessary notches down here to match up with our skirt darts, but we need a notch on our front shoulder to match with the dart on our back shoulder. So I'm going to put these together, folding along my front shoulder. And starting at my neckline, making sure that's a smooth transition from my front to back neckline. I'm going to line up my shoulder seams. And once I get to this my first dart leg, traveling in this direction, once I get to the first dart leg, I'm going to put a notch on there. I'm going to do it in pencil just in case I have to balance anything out. And then again, omitting my dart intake, I'm going to move my notch to my other dart leg and measure along the rest of the dart. About a 1/16 of an inch discrepancy here at the armhole, but I'm perfectly fine with that. So remember, omit your dart intake. This segment here from your neckline to the first dart leg should match from the neckline to the notch on your front bodice, and from the second dart leg to the armhole should match from your notch to the armhole on the front bodice again. Now that takes care of balancing and truing the bodice to the skirts, but now we need to prepare for the sleeve. That is the 5th piece that we need for this basic 5 draft, and to do that we need to take some measurements. I have to measure the front and back armholes. Now I cannot reiterate this enough. The measurements that I get on my draft may not match your draft. Going forward, drafting the sleeve, please use your measurements. I'll be using mine in the demo, but please use the measurements that you get from your drafts. So I'm measuring my front armhole. Eight inches. I'm gonna jot that down. About 8 1/4. And I'll jot that down. So I've got 8 inches on the front and 8 1/4 on my back. Yours may be different. With the bodices and the skirts balanced true, we've got a couple of notches here. Let's move into drafting the sleeve.